An innovator is somebody who introduces new methods, ideas, or products. In every single industry, there are new innovators who come in and out the door every few years. Some of these people survive, and a lot of them don't because they're not financially savvy and they don't know how to navigate the business side of the industry. And in fashion, you can think about people like Vivienne Westwood, Yoji Yamamoto, even Rei Kawakubo. These designers had their own financial difficulty at certain points, right? In any industry, innovators are the backbone because they're the ones who are constantly pushing new ideas that get copied and used up by, faster companies or a lot more commercial companies. So in fashion, a lot of innovators will set the trend and then fast fashion companies will copy them. And also, when you're an innovator, a lot of these big conglomerates like LVMH or Kering, who own Louis Vuitton and Gucci, want to buy you up and then change your entire design language and your entire brand ethos to sell more and more commercial products, and that will lessen the value of your art. And this happens to a lot of innovators throughout the years. Also, when innovators get copied later on, it usually stings a lot more when the original work came out in a certain time frame and people did not like it at the time at all. But it's like when people come around, all of a sudden it's the hottest thing 2 years later. And above all, innovators have to keep recreating themselves to stay at the front of fashion, or else they'll get grouped up with the copycats that are, making a name for themselves off of the innovator style. There's no rest for innovators in any industry. Now, what really got me thinking about innovation and how innovators are perceived in fashion and in art in general was the new Balenciaga Spring 25 or Resort 25 collection. And it was the same thing as like the past 5 years Demna has been doing, even the same order of the products, like the start of the show being orthodox Christian looks with the drapery and all black double-breasted coats and long coats and stuff like that. And the accessories just seem to keep on getting bigger and taller, like the shoes keep on getting bigger. The bags keep on getting a bit wackier. There's like a shoebox clutch and like a garment bag. And it's like, it just seems like a lot of the same thing that he keeps on doing over and over again. And it's kind of like the same almost gimmick of like, oh, we're perverting this original item that was made for this and turning it into this, like the shoebox and the garment bag. The only really refreshing part of the show for me was the woman's wear in the middle of it. I think that was really new and nice, and it was different from them now. But other than that, there's just a lot of stuff that's just being so repeated. Like some of the looks look so repeated from seasons before. My initial reaction was that maybe he's just having a lot of problems with merchandisers, saying that he needs to put certain things on the runway because that sells the most. Or the less likely option is that he's actually running out of ideas. But of course, with fashion, context is everything. If you look at how Demna burst onto the fashion scene in 2014 with Vetements, his fashion brand that was co-created with his brother Guram, we were looking at a brand that had very Eastern European influence, seeing as how Demna grew up in Georgia, which was a war-torn country at the time. And he was heavily influenced by pop culture, especially like culture in LA, which we now know because of one of his seasons, like 2 seasons back at this point, I think. And I'm not gonna say he was the first person to try and distort the line between luxury and streetwear because we'll kind of reserve that for Shane Oliver, okay? But his take was very refreshing because obviously every designer's design language, has to be influenced by their own reference points and their own journey in life. And we get this very unique perspective from somebody like Demna who has had his journey and how he puts like pop cultural references on like skirts and stuff and hoodies, but he gives it like this certain touch that makes it still starts a conversation. And that's how he burst onto the scene. And it was a hit. Even though a lot of the times I feel like Vetements it was more appreciated in hindsight, it was definitely popular when it was still very active and Demna was still at the brand. He left in 2019 to fully focus on his creative director job at Balenciaga, and ever since then, a lot of people have said it's not been the same. But when he was there, it was hot. Like Rihanna was wearing his clothes, Kanye was wearing his clothes, and at his shows, they had a big like. Even though Virgil Abloh was kind of doing similar things with like Off-White, Off-White wasn't as high up and as respected as Vetements in like the luxury fashion space. So Demna's brand Vetements had a lot of people talking, and it was causing a lot of ripple effects in fashion, and his influence was slowly starting to grow. His image was slowly starting to grow and spread. And in fashion, when you're the one that's in the lead with innovating and pushing the margin further of what can be considered this or that, your design becomes copied and wholesaled. And it didn't help that Balenciaga is obviously one of the biggest brands in the world, and he was giving his image to Balenciaga as well as Vetements until he left Vetements in 2019. So all the exposure from Balenciaga, along with all of this widespread success of Vetements, only meant a recipe for disaster for Demna's image to just get absolutely spread across the board of fashion. It's no secret that the baggy, oversized look in fashion has been in the lead since, I say, the mid 2010s up until now. It's a lot different than how it was in the 2000s and early 2010s with, Eddie Slimane kind of paving the way for that skinny look. But again, the success of Demna's work was just too great. A lot of the credit can be and is given to them now for this current look that we have. But when you're an innovator and there's people starting to copy you, you have to constantly be innovating. You have to constantly be trying to draw the line between the imitators and the originator, as well as keep on pushing it so that your look stays fresh, so that nobody can actually catch up to you ever. That's one of the main problems that innovators have. Now, Demna hasn't had too much of a problem with that, seeing as how his reference points are extremely specific to his upbringing and he stays true to his work, and a lot of his work is actually autobiographical. And side note, an autobiographical designer is almost impossible to replicate. That's why Alexander McQueen will never ever be replicated, because a lot of his work was so personal, right?
If I ever get that old and I'm still around and I leave my company, I just burn the place down.
Yeah.
There's no one to work there.
Really? So you'd never let someone carry on the McQueen tradition or the McQueen brand if you weren't actively involved?
I don't think so. I mean, it does. Because that person will have to come up with the concepts for my show, and my shows are so personal. How can that be? I mean, and then unless it turns into an awful runway of non-existenceness, and
That's a concept. I don't want.
But with Demna now, when your work starts becoming less and less about personal references and more about like the perceived notion of your brand and what your brand appears to be in the public, or because so much of the other brands in fashion have started to catch up with what your brand looks like, your image looks less like your image and more like the widespread image of the fashion industry. So when it becomes less and less identifiable as Demna expressing himself on the runway, and more like, oh, this is Demna's Balenciaga, and that's just Balenciaga at this point, the line becomes very blurred between originator and imitator, because the look that Demna bursts onto the scene with is no longer the Demna Vasalia look, it's more like the Balenciaga look. People are tired of the Balenciaga look. But let's say hypothetically he stayed at Vetements, I don't think he would have had this much of a problem, because he wouldn't have the pressure of shareholders and merchandisers constantly telling him what type of hoodie, or what type of shirt, or what type of shoes sell the most on the runway and what they need. So I think he would have had a lot more of creative freedom without all the pressure of, the back office telling him what to put on the runway and what he needs to sell. And I think his image would have been very intact and grew into more of an authentic thing at Vetements. But because, Balenciaga is of course a money-making brand first at this point, he's in a terrible situation, I feel like. And he's expressed his gripes about, merchandisers and compromising his originality and what he wants for the sales, and how it bothers him a lot. So it seems like Demna is in a horrible bind. Or is he? If we look at designers like Alexander McQueen and John Galliano, Alexander McQueen was very autobiographical, pulling from his own life, his own experiences, and his own reference points, like his lineage, the women around him, and those type of things. You look at John Galliano, he was very imaginative and romantic, and he'd build entire worlds for each runway and each collection. But the thing is, these designers were masters at themes and recreating the feeling of a specific look every single collection. Everything else could change, but the theme and the design language will remain the same, and that's why you can look at a McQueen garment from the Birds collection, or the Nihilism collection, or the Dante collection, or even Plato's Atlantis, and say, oh, this is all so McQueen, even though all four of those collections probably look so different. Or you can look at a John Galliano collection from his actual brand, and then a John Galliano collection at Dior, and be like, oh, this is something that only Galliano could think of, and it could look entirely different from each other, right? But the point is, great designers know how to keep a language and a look despite the clothes looking different every time. It's about striking a balance between always having the same theme and vibe of a collection with always having a different look. And McQueen and Galliano are monsters of designers, like I'm talking monsters. So they struck that balance fairly easily. With Demna, a lot of the clothes haven't been changing, but some of the themes kind of barely shifted here and there. But it all looks so painfully like something we've seen before for like the past few seasons. So he hasn't really had that balance at all lately. But like I said, McQueen and Galliano were monsters. So can we really expect other designers to be able to output that level of excellence? It's not very realistic to do anyways, and let's not forget that those two were on heavy substances creating every single one of their collections at some point. And when you look at context, again, because context is everything, in the landscape that we live in now, money means so much to these brands, so they probably don't want much to change because that would alienate their customer base, because they expect something from Balenciaga every time that they will know. But if you switch it up too much, then the customer base will feel alienated and disillusioned, as if the clothes aren't for them anymore. So that's also something that you have to take into account. What I'm trying to do is present the question of, are these expectations on them not too harsh, and should he be cut some slack? I'm not the one that's doing it. I'm not necessarily defending him, but I'm just trying to be the devil's advocate and present two different sides of the same coin, right? Them not repeating the same type of looks and themes on the runway over and over again can also be looked at as a designer mastering their craft. A lot of designers don't do that anymore, by the way. Now, if we look at Rick Owens, Mr. Go to the Gym. He began in the mid 90s, and I think he just hit the 30-year mark the other day. His fashion development has been very slow, and he can be now considered as one of the best avant-garde designers in the industry. And he didn't have any big corporations on his back telling him what to send on the runway. He didn't have people pressuring him to change his style, and he himself didn't even think he was going to last that long because he knew his look wasn't going to change much. But he took a very long time developing his design ethos. It changed over the years, of course, but when you build your fan base and you build your look like that, now you're one of the last ones standing, and you're one of the best designers on the planet and one of the most legendary designers on the planet. He was able to innovate and develop slowly. I feel like Demna was cursed by his own big splash, like his own huge immediate impact. I think that unfortunately just really messed up his how people perceive him in the fashion industry. Now, don't get me wrong, I feel like Demna is in the lead in terms of innovation and like intellectual design, because he can have some really brilliant moments on the runway, right? But when you come through with such an immediate effect and such a drastic effect, and you're the leader of the entire new look because it all came from you, I feel like a lot of people are expecting you to continue that outrageous output to keep on changing the game. And it's just not very realistic, in my opinion. You can't expect somebody to, because he came with his design. He came with what he came with. There's so many designers who come with their look and are allowed to stay with it. But with him, it's like, okay, of course, I think it has a lot to do with like how he speaks in his interviews about like how he's not trying to be gimmicky, but he is very gimmicky a lot. But the breakneck pace of fashion is just impossible to keep up with, no matter who you are. Like, you're not about to be changing the game every 2 seasons. Like, no. I feel like Demna is the only designer that gets that much backlash for doing the same thing over and over again, possibly just because of the position he ended up in with Balenciaga. Let's look at some other designers who had to go through some years of development and hardships, all while being at the front of fashion innovation, right? Let's look at Yohji Yamamoto and Rei Kawakubo. When they burst on the fashion scene in France in the early 80s, a lot of people were calling them Hiroshima chic and things like that because of, their black drapey looks, the deconstruction, the melancholy, just the avant-garde look. It's avant-garde because it wasn't anything looking like that at the time, right? If you look into context of it, do you think many people would have cared if they weren't Japanese? Like, if they were just another French designer or maybe even an Italian, do you think people would have cared that much? No, they wouldn't. And when all of that buzz and all of that fanfare wears off, all you have is the brand that's doing the same thing they were doing when they were so hot and new and different 5 years ago. Does that mean that the brand is bad because it's not that different? It's not changing much? No, because when you burst onto the scene that hot, you're still growing, but you're just that popular. So you have to grow in front of a wider audience. I know the expectations are so high. The difference with now and back then is that nobody was crucifying Yohji and Rei for maybe just keep on doing the same thing that they were doing. Because back then it wasn't that serious, and back then people were more understanding and they knew what it took. Nobody was saying that Comme des Garçons and Yohji Yamamoto were tired or out of steam back then. So if we look on the context of fashion back then compared to fashion now is just obviously not that very big on realistic, slow mastery and design. They think it was never about the clothes anymore anyway, after Bernard Arnault took over and did all of the stuff that he did. But nowadays, the expectations are just very unrealistic on a lot of these designers. There are still some monsters around like J.W. Anderson and, in my opinion, Wills Bonner, who are, doing what they're doing at an alarming rate and really carving out their niche in the fashion industry for what they do, without having all these people complaining at them saying that their clothes look the same over and over again. But we can't expect these designers to constantly be recreating themselves over and over a thousand times, once or twice a year. It's just not realistic. Yes, Demna's collections have become predictable and almost formulaic, but let's not act like he's not one of the most brilliant designers on the planet. So I'm not saying that he won't innovate anymore. It would just be very hard to not see any innovation from him in the next 3 years or so. And with a lot of fashion, we're just gonna have to wait and see. But that's all I had to say on this topic. I really hope that video wasn't too sporadic. I feel like it was almost off topic a lot. I hope it was relevant to you and the title and what you wanted to learn from this video. I hope you did learn something. I hope you came away with a new perspective, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe if you did. I would appreciate it. Share with a friend. And that's all I had to say. Thank you so much and goodbye.